Welcome everyone to another edition of CPA's webinar, where this time we will be discussing some of the recent and future steps that various stakeholders are taking on a path to greening the City of London. So the year 2019 was the year of awakening to sustainability, where we finally saw a positive shift in approach from a nice to have to a must have, spurred by climate change, marine, air, plastic pollution, and so on. And it might be that 2020 will become a year of awakening to public health and well-being, spurred by the coronavirus pandemic. So what we're witnessing, which I think is pretty incredible, that these themes together are now so high up on the agenda because of the global impact they made in such a short space of time. Both climate change and the virus do not discriminate, and that's what makes them powerful enough to shake up traditions, push the boundaries, and accelerate collaborations that may have never seemed possible before. So I am really excited to hear opinions on these two subjects of on one hand, public health and well-being, and on the other on climate change and sustainability. From the people who work around those issues day to day and are turning them into tangible outcomes. So today I have with me Barnaby Collins, Board Director at DP9, Gwyn Richards, Interim Chief Planning Officer and Development Director at City of London Corporation, and Deborah Saunt, Founding Director at DSDHA. So welcome, Barnaby, Gwyn, and Deborah. Thank you so much for your time, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts on these very important subjects. Just to let you know to our viewers that you can join the conversation online using the CPA's Twitter account. So all of you have a huge experience of working in the City of London for a number of years. And in your own way, you all contribute to ensuring that the future of the City of London is green. More so than ever, we see architects, developers, planners, and the City Corporation all working towards providing more green space across the city's built environment, including green roofs and public parks. At the same time, the corporation is removing vehicular traffic from the area's streets and roads through temporary public safety measures in response to COVID-19, but also through the longer-term transport strategy for a more pedestrian and cyclist-friendly city. So this leads me to a question to all of you. You have obviously worked around those matters before, but how much more important is this subject to you now? How much significance are you giving to this subject in your daily work and life, particularly looking through the prism of recent events? Have you been using green and public spaces to a greater extent during lockdown? Maybe we start from Deborah.
Oh, well, I think everybody's been outside as much as possible, haven't they? It's been incredible just going out into the streets and particularly our green spaces since, was it last week when the go-ahead was given for people to actually sit down. But even before that, just the throngs of people. I live near Clapham Common. It's become a sports ground rather than a place just to look at nature. And I've also been cycling around the city, and it's just been wonderful to see the streets completely packed with cyclists using that opportunity for the peace and quiet to get out there. So I think everybody's been really, really aware of the well-being quotient in our city.
Thank you. And Barnaby?
Yes, I've been stuck in Wandsworth, so I've been accessing my garden and Wandsworth Common, which is really just a dog walk every day and kicking a ball around with the boys. But what I've noticed is that nature seems to be reclaiming the built environment a little bit. I've got a family of a vixen and 6 cubs underneath my decking, which is terrorizing my dog, but actually it's quite nice to see them, because yesterday they were a pest. Today I've actually quite just appreciating seeing them, which I think is a big change.
That's lovely. How about you, Gwyn?
I'm out in West London in Ealing, and the nearest open space is Horsington Hill. And it's brilliant. It's got an ancient oak woodland. And he also has brilliant views over towards Windsor Castle to the west and back into the city skyline to the, so it's great. I think I've noticed a re-engagement of people with nature. there are people using Horsington Hill which you'd never probably would have used that in the past. So that's really heartening to see.
Thank you. So let's get into our conversation in terms of public health and well-being that now has been the main topic. So this is a question to all of you. So beyond the recently announced temporary transport measures from TfL and the City Corporation, which is aiming to help people return to work safely, do you think there will be fundamental shift in the way buildings and public spaces are designed in the city to create more space for public health and well-being? Let's start from Gwyn again.
I don't think there's a fundamental shift change. I think what COVID-19 will prove to be will be a catalyst to accelerate the changes that already are taking place in terms of reimagining the public realm, roof gardens, taking people on top of buildings, and pedestrian and cycling priority of the transport strategy and planning policy as well in terms of urban greening. All of those were in place, and we were delivering pretty radical schemes on urban greening, for example, and pedestrian priority schemes in advance of what happened. But I think this will refocus and be a catalyst, I think, to the acceleration of these changes. So I don't think this event in its own right is a game changer. I think it will accelerate these very positive changes that have already taken place.
Okay, thank you. How do you feel about it, Deborah?
Well, I think I'm an unusual architect because I'm also an urban designer and we do landscape too. So we kind of straddle, the green part of the city as well as the hard stuff we're building. And I think for architects, there will be a shift now to understand the built environment as a kind of total natural environment. So it's almost like a real sort of shift away from it being us and them and to being, we're all in it together. And I'd give you an example. When you build on a site, it's very unusual for people to actually check the geology below the site, to look at the land drainage. This is the designers. You might leave that to engineers, but I think now designers will want to know more about what's the natural biodiversity and the ecology that they can encourage. So I'm imagining that there will be changes. And also I think just in terms of imagination, designers will be looking at temporary pop-up spaces. They'll be looking at permanent, coming to Gwyn with suggestions to green this space that's maybe hard at the moment to make it green. So I think it will inspire people to shift their perspective, really.
Okay, thank you. Barnaby, what's your view?
My view is that as much as recently the home has become an extension of the office, I think the office will become an extension of the home. Personally, I prefer to keep the two separate, but well-being has been very high on the agenda for quite a while now, with little steps being taken each time. But I think that COVID will probably represent a bigger leap than that. For example, I think that reclaiming the streets for pedestrians, cyclists, e-scooters, that'll accelerate very fast. But one particularly interesting point relating to buildings is that when I first started work, developers designed for 1 to 15 density occupation. Yesterday we were aiming at 1 to 8. We'll tomorrow see a backpedal from that. That'll be either half the headcount or double the rent, or a mixture of the both. I'm not quite sure how that's going to work, but that's going to put pressure on matters too. But as Gwyn says, I think it will probably accelerate what's measures that are already being undertaken.
That's interesting. Thank you for giving us views from different angles. A question to Deborah. The focus on the public realm seems to be already in place in Broadgate, where you were designing different spaces, including the transformation of Exchange Square into a public park. So can you tell us more about this project? And also, in addition, can you explore the benefits of urban greening and the ways it can maximize public realm and health, but not just through the pedestrian movement, but as a place to dwell and socialize?
Well, it's been a real privilege to work on Broadgate because it's obviously one of the, it's always been a kind of test bed for new ways of doing things. And so about 3 or 4 years ago, we were invited to look at, first of all, bringing in temporary changes to those plazas and the circle with which we're all familiar. And then over time, we've sort of tested out different responses with temporary interventions, and till now we're finally developing Exchange Square, and we're going to quadruple the amount of green space. If you go to Exchange Square in your mind at the moment, you can remember there's that wonderful lawn on which people gather for, you know, public events, you know, celebrations, and that's going to be, you know, quadrupled. There's going to be much more place for seating, and it's going to really sort of increase the biodiversity of Broadgate hugely. In terms of the different spaces, we looked at each space very specifically in terms of its microclimate, and it's a real phenomenon in the city that you can be within 2 minutes walk of a space that's very warm. So if you take the Circle, for example, really warm piazza feel, and then just moments away in Finsbury Avenue Square, it's very much darker, cooler, and so you have to respond with the right kind of plants to reflect that. And sort of really capture, you know, what the right landscape and nature is for that space. And then finally, under Broadgate Tower, we put in a whole forest of bamboo, which is just, you know that one?
Yes, I love it.
Well, what's been fantastic about that is we first of all put the bamboo in because it was very, very noisy, sort of windy space. So we wanted to make a virtue out of the senses and how you'd feel about hearing the rustle of bamboo. We created lots of places to have outdoor meetings, and we didn't realize at the time that we were actually providing facilities for the whole city. So what's been great is we've been going back and looking and seeing on Instagram, for example, and playing to Barnaby's point, that people don't just come to Broadgate from 9 till 5, Monday to Friday. They're going there in the weekends. They're using it as part of their extended sort of life if they live near the city, so for neighbours nearby. But we're also finding that people are staying after work and having, say, picnics on the new landscapes that we're creating. So that's very much people extending their dwell time in the city to have that social life that we're all looking forward to. And what we've noticed, which is really interesting, I've just been looking at the photographs pre-COVID, is that people do distribute themselves very, very sensibly on the designs that we've created. So it's been a really interesting kind of test bed for the city for what might happen in other areas. And I think just to conclude, the most gratifying thing has been that people have been diverting their walks through Broadgate now in order to see the greenery. So that's something that we dreamt might happen. But we've got testimonials from individuals, many of them saying, I used to walk along Bishopsgate, I now go through Broadgate. It's a bit longer, but it's greener. So it's been a fantastic kind of project. And I suggest everybody go and have a look when we're allowed back in the city, or look online and just see what's there.
I did the same, because I walk through this bamboo forest because it kind of brings me to as if you were in Japan and you have this kind of forest bathing almost experience. So it's definitely a nicer way to travel around the city.
Yeah, and just on the bamboo, finally, I discovered recently that bamboo produces 35% more oxygen than trees. So that's probably why you feel good. You're actually getting a blast of more oxygen. So they really are much more, they have a great carbon sequestration sort of benefit.
Grow faster, so maybe you will see more bamboos around the city everywhere. So thank you. Question to Gwyn this time. How is the corporation encouraging investment into public and shared spaces, making the city streets more friendly for pedestrian and cyclists, and creating spaces for people to rest and relax?
I mean, I guess there's two pretty radical policy documents. One is the transport strategy, which for the first time in the city prioritises pedestrians and cycling, and that is at the same time as our emerging city plan, which introduces pretty radical policies on greening and public realm and so on. So that's the pincer movement on the kind of the big problems. But what we've been pretty good in the city over the last decade, say, to do enhancement schemes on the public realm. But what we really keen to do now is totally reimagine the whole concept of public realm. public realm in the past, people just saw it to pavements and carriageways. Well, we don't want those carriageways to have vehicles in many of the areas in the city. So it's a structural change to the way that we look at public realm. And also, when we look at public realm, we should not forget that we need to provide new routes, new capillaries in the city. So you'll see developments coming forward which reintroduce the small grained capillaries of the city, which have incrementally kind of closed up since the 19th century to get the blood running and people flowing as well. And one of the challenges that we've really faced in the city cluster in particular is twofold. Is there's very limited opportunity to provide new public realm for people to dwell because of the intensity of pressures of buildings. And also we've carried out a pretty comprehensive wind and sunlight and thermal comfort modelling of the city cluster. And with the best will in the world, the quality of the microclimate in some of those dense built areas isn't great. So what we're doing is we're actually pushing up the places to dwell on top of buildings to create this new layer of public realm, free public roof gardens and so on. It's a pretty radical, groundbreaking, internationally groundbreaking concept, and to reimagine the public realm as a three-dimensional quality as well. We're also, we take a much broader definition of public realm. Some of the biggest assets that we've got coming through are free public exhibitions for the Roman Wall in Vine Street, the Temple of Mithras, for the crypts of 50 Fenchurch Street. These are new areas where people can gain access to. So it's a widening of the definition of public realm. I think the one thing that we're really keen on is not also a question of quantity of public realm, it's the quality. So we're going to introduce new thermal comfort guidelines. Thermal comfort is, if you look at BBC weather, if it's today, it's 20 degrees, very brisk east wind. It's actually the real thing, it's probably 16. So we're calibrating, and it's really complex, the wind, the seasonal wind patterns, wind, sunlight to ground, humidity and temperature throughout the year to provide the toolkit. And much like Deborah was saying, really understand those kind of nuances in the public realm, those areas which have really warm places for you to be in the sun in spring, and what those areas which probably require a bit more help and so on. And we're introducing that as a toolkit for developers and planning system, hopefully in autumn now, as a whole new way of us being able to understand what we're playing with in terms of public realm.
So thank you for this, Gwyn. I had the pleasure of seeing a glimpse of the presentation that you were giving a few months ago about this, and it's a very interesting concept where you kind of release the tension from the ground floor and elevating the traffic and accessibility of public spaces off the ground. And it's what's also really interesting that it would be amazing if you could have this collection of smart data which tells you where you can go to sit and relax at this particular day because it's more pleasurable, you know, accessible to people. So they use the smart city finally to find ways and have a variety of amenities to enjoy on a particular day. So this leads me to a further question, like, is there any limit from both supply and demand perspective to the number of roof gardens and the number of people wishing to visit them, with 50 Fenchurch Street joining the neighbour at number 20, and with 1 Fen Court boasting a public access roof garden as well?
Do you know, I honestly don't think there is. If you ever try to book a weekend slot on 20 Fenchurch Street, it's impossible. It's an insatiable demand there. It's changing the psychology of the public. Suddenly to feel that they own some of that building, it's relevant to them. They can go up to the top of that building. We have 500,000, close to 500,000 people, or we did, for COVID-19 coming into the city to work every day in a city of 9 million people. That's 13% of the UK population. Providing these places to dwell, to go up, to enjoy the view is critical, I think, for the city to be an attractive place for workers and visitors. And it's not a question of providing the same thing everywhere in terms of roof plans. Each one's unique. One undershaft would be managed by the Museum of London, curated. There'd be an exhibition space and 2 state schoolrooms there. One Leadenhall Court at 4th floor level, looking at historic, south-facing historic market there's no market roofscape. Each one has a unique vantage point and a unique quality. And Ventures, most recent, will have a winter garden facing south, which makes it much more usable in the winter months. The one thing I find really compelling about these is architecture in the city has always been based on economic hierarchy, where the rich and the affluent always had the upper stories, be the boardrooms, the cocktail bars, the high-end restaurants. This is inverting the social and economic hierarchy of the city. And one of my, probably the high point of my planning career was going up to 20 Venture Streets, 120, sorry, Garden in February, and seeing with my eldest son and seeing a family, an extended British Bangladeshi family from probably the Guinness estate, bringing their picnic up there with their grandmother, with the kids playing. They were going to use that as a park for the afternoon. And I think that is unique. That is something that never used to happen in the city. So it's a democratization type of process. And it starts to bring economic and social inequality into the public realm right at the forefront of the agenda in the city.
Thank you, Gwyn. This time question to Barnaby. As a planner, and you advise a number of investors and developers, and how is the development community responding to such guidance and planning policies? What are their recent exemplary schemes, other than what Gwyn just mentions, which incorporate green and public spaces?
It's fair to say that the incorporation of sky gardens in commercial development is not necessarily welcomed by developers because it comes at such a huge cost. But sometimes that cost is the price you have to pay to get a tall building approval in the first place. Sky gardens and public spaces at high level can work very well. I do worry though that if all the towers that are consented are built, there is a danger that they might compete with each other. What we don't want is deserts in the sky, and deserts by I mean uninhabited spaces. So I do have a slight concern there, but I'm also a great fan of other schemes which sort of merge the interface with public and private functions at ground level, because I think these are increasingly becoming sort of touchdown social spaces rather than just a big grand office reception area. And I think they can work very well. And I also think that by definition, public open space suggests that it's open to the air, and I don't think necessarily it has to be, because sometimes you want to be sheltered from the sun, sometimes you want to be sheltered from the rain. So I don't think it's necessarily single one-dimensional. It must be high, it must be green, it must be open. I'm not quite sure how, for example, how we would green the gherkin or green the cheese grater, but those being sort of two exceptions. But one scheme I've worked on recently is Cityscape House, a hotel in High Holborn, which has an urban greening factor of 1.3. I mean, it's 40,000 odd plants on it. It's an amazing scheme. Building regs may kibosh delivery of that. So there are unexpected consequences, perhaps, of mass screening, which haven't yet been worked through. But I think, generally speaking, the development community welcomes it because at the end of the day, the tenants seem to want it, and developers will obviously want to provide what tenants want.
Exactly. Thank you. And we also see this in the terms of an investor demand to make sure that the buildings are greener and performing better in terms of sustainability. But a good point on, competing against each other. Question to both of you, Gwyn and Barnaby. The built environment is responsible for 40% of the UK's carbon emission. So with that figure likely to be far higher in dense urban cities like the City of London, our industry must play a vital role in tackling and mitigating climate change. So do you see urban greening as a solution for capturing and reducing the city's carbon emission?
In my view, I think urban greening is part of the solution, but it can't be the whole of the solution. And it shouldn't be seen as the easy stick to wield. And it shouldn't be wallpaper. There's much more deep-rooted need to reduce energy cost, energy use. And it's not just the responsibility of the building provider. We mustn't forget it's the building user and company and personal level too. But it's certainly part of the solution, I think.
I think I agree. It's a weapon in the armoury. But it is a pretty important weapon. I mean, Barnaby referred to Cityscape House. That green wall will absorb 8 tons of carbon dioxide, and it'll generate 6 tons of oxygen. So greening has a huge role to play in carbon reduction. But I think it's fair to say, being positive, there has been a significant drop in the carbon emission in the square mile, and that's mainly because of decarbonisation of the electricity supply. There's also more carbon efficient buildings, and we are introducing new policies with the London Plan, zero carbon. So we are very optimistic, and there's the issue of the circular economy and embedded carbon as well. But what I would say is I think the onus on urban greening is going to fall increasingly on the buildings rather than what we can put on the public realm. There's a reason it's very rare that we can actually plant a tree because of the services and subterranean constraints. Trees also impair, especially in the cluster, pedestrian movement, so that they are quite challenging things. So the buildings are going to have to take the lion's share of urban greening. And the other thing that I'm really keen is that urban greening doesn't become a privatised concept, because in the past, a lot of the roof terraces, which were for the occupiers of the offices, were the green roofs and so on, they were imperceptible from the public realm. So we're going to see a lot more emphasis on vertical greening. And the benefits of urban greening are immense, just in terms of particulate pollution and so on. I think urban greening is going to be pretty key in terms of our carbon targets. And I think the development industry to have to take the lion's share of that.
Thank you, Gwyn. And a question to all of you, especially now after, well, still during, but in the post-COVID world, what opportunities are there to transform the city into a more humane, gentle, cleaner, quieter, safer city, which is economically and socially inclusive? So how can we diversify this economic attraction of the area? Maybe let's start from Deborah.
Well, I would go straight to the point that Gwyn just made of if you make these public spaces free and welcoming, people will come, and you do get a different demographic. It is extraordinary. If you make that wayfinding through these, so I think seeing the city through green routes that can link very much between one area and another, you will find that if you plant greenery, people almost play it, I call it urban dot to dot. If you see a bit of greenery and you see a bit of greenery and you see a bit of greenery, you follow the greenery. And we certainly have had a huge range of the demographic at Broadgate has been extraordinary. And the fact that also in terms of well-being, people are using Broadgate in a way that none of us expected. They're using it for workouts early in the morning. This is before COVID. And so you're getting a real diversity of people coming in from the surrounding areas, from Shoreditch and from to the east, and actually exercising here. So I think going for these acts of public good and generosity will pay back economically, because people come in, they feel comfortable, and then they spend money. And so I think you will find a virtuous circle there.
Thank you. Barnaby?
I think, sorry.
Sorry, go on, Gwyn.
No, I think COVID-19 has really highlighted a renewed appreciation of public service, public spiritedness. And I'm a public sector planner, and that's normally a swear word. I think public service now, we should all be public servants. We should all serve the public good. I think that's the strongest message that comes out of it. That when you design a scheme, you have to think about, what does this do for the public? And in an inclusive sense, is this relevant to the private estates, the east? Is it relevant to children and families and so on? I think that's the key change in direction that I see from where we're going through at the moment of COVID-19.
No, I'd add to that, some of the research we did for the Tulip project threw up quite an alarming thing, which is that a lot of kids, school kids on the South Bank, saw the city as this sort of stone and glass jungle, totally inaccessible, never wanted to visit it because there's no point, it's just a financial place for bankers. But that is changing. The city wants it to change, and the market is wanting it to change too. And if it's a green city, maybe that'll help encourage people to come to see the city, make it the 24/7 place that everybody seems to want, and make the city an even better place to work, perhaps.
Thank you. And I think this is what we want to promote as a CPA Next Gen as well, because there is such a huge diversity of the occupiers, and not just financial companies, but they are, people from creative businesses and tech, and they do sort of need this space to remain and to continue to be creative in their work. So the promotion of the variety of spaces for a variety of users is very much at the core of what we want to promote. I have a question from the audience that I would just like to bring to and tie it to the fact what you, Gwyn, mentioned about vertical greening. So we have a question. The city recently approved a development in Holborn Viaduct, which featured a planted facade. Is this something the city are looking to promote even more?
Absolutely. I mean, there are two game-changing planning permissions. One, and Barnaby will know a lot about this, City Cape House, which is the green building in Holborn, the greenest building in Europe. What that building does to combat air pollution, the heat island effect, biodiversity, studs, is an absolute exemplar. And the other one I would highlight is the one that went through Thursday, which is 50 Fenchurch Street, in terms of the 36-fold increase in public realm. And again, public realm in the wider sense, the elevated roof garden, the subterranean exhibition and so on, and the wider pedestrian route. I would ask the development industry to look at those two consents, and both of them went unanimously through committee, which is pretty unprecedented in a large committee. So you can see there's a political appetite there amongst our members as well. These to be, and I think it was even mentioned at our committee on Citycape, this is the exemplar for people to follow. So I don't like to single out individual schemes because every scheme has its own benefits and so on. But those two, I think, in terms of what we're talking about today, in terms of green infrastructure and so on, are real exemplars to follow.
And I was really happy to see this because I actually looked at the design access statement for this, and especially because I was walking and working around Holborn for quite a while, and whenever I would walk past this building with my dog, I just wanted to scribble on it, please redevelop me, because it was just crying for it. And I know the history, it was just hard to unlock it. So I'm really happy to see what's going on with this scheme. And yes, can't wait to see it as this model sort of redevelopment.
But there is a point of caution, which I think Barnaby alluded to, is that after Grenfell, obviously, the fire regulations are tightening up. This is a hotel scheme. There are certain proposals coming up which might preclude this being implemented. We hope it will be implemented, but we'll be liaising with our district surveyor to see what the implications of those are. Okay,
thank you. Question to Deborah. With you as this architect and urban planner, what other global or UK cities have you been particularly, taking inspiration from, like in terms of being successful in encouraging biodiversity, urban greenery, and maybe even urban farming? What can we learn from them?
Well, I've been lucky enough recently to be writing the brief for the reimagining of Grosvenor Square in the West End. So I was lucky enough to go on some trips to visit different cities and see what global best practice was. And I've got to say, Paris really impressed me. I mean, they've always had amazing, very controlled green spaces, but it was their real kind of energy of testing these new things. I loved walking along the South Bank and seeing the floating islands, these parks they have on these barges. I thought, and they're kind of wild and wonderful. And I think there's going to be a bit of a taste change going on, and Paris is maybe showing the way ahead there, that we don't necessarily want clipped lawns anymore. This is what we learnt on Grosvenor Square. We want a whole variety of different plant types that change over the seasons, that encourage different plants, and they're not kind of automatically sort of fertilized and irrigated with great big systems. You need to leave things to be. So I think we'll see the rise of initiatives like that. But I mean, it's a good point playing to what Gwyn said, is you can see wonderful rain gardens around the UK that people have put into streetscapes. And that's a kind of urban greening. But in the city, can you really afford to give over much needed public routes and thoroughfares to things like rain gardens? So it's a real challenge. The other place, of course, is Singapore, where they do have this great metric that for every square metre of site that you use that would have been green, you should re-provide that on the building. So they actually have it as a kind of metric, which I think really ups people's game to focus. So I would say that, and there are a lot of kind of just pop-up things like in Brixton, edible bus stop. You know, you get lots of these kind of community-led schemes that are just wonderful with greening. And then you get organisations now encouraging gardening. If you've got a bit of outdoor space, a terrace, you know, workspaces I'm talking about. Even in my studio here, we have greening going on with, you know, with vegetables and growing. So I think one of the things we might find in the wellbeing agenda is not just green space on the top of roofs to sit and admire, but those that you can actually consume and for your well-being contend and look after.
And what do you mean when I was, maybe you can elaborate on the term that you used, time-based urbanism in your design?
Well, time-based urbanism means instead of just designing for the now and saying client wants something, here is the answer today, you take a look at what a guy called Stuart Brand, who wrote a really wonderful book called The Whole Earth Catalogue back in the 60s, and another book called How Buildings Learn. He said you should look at the long now. And so that's looking at time over the millennia and what's happening to nature, what's happening with infrastructure, what's happening day to day, week to week, season to season. And so that means that, for example, if you go to the Circle at Broadgate, you go into what was previously a very stony surface on the paving, and you had greenery at high level. And we've put in greenery in planters, and you might go in and think that's permanent, but actually you can get a pallet lifter and you can move the plants around. So we've learned from Versailles where they do that. But that means that that space can adjust over time. So at Christmas, the plants move to the edge so they can have a Christmas fair. In the summer, it can move to where you need shade. So I think we're looking at really using time and process in design much more. So it's less about product, more about process and time.
So now, question to Barnaby and Gwyn. If we, instead of just looking at designing for now, but at this long now, we obviously have a target to become carbon neutral. How do you see us being on this path? Are we pushing hard enough? Are we doing enough to meet this target? Maybe start with Barnaby.
Yes, I think that the development community is wanting to achieve that. I'm working on a new scheme which is not even in pre-app yet, so I've not revealed too much, but the client there is a financial institution, and it has set out an aim. It wants to be as carbon neutral, or as close to carbon neutral as possible, because it sees a corporate benefit from that, to be able to say to the wider corporate world rather than just the property world, this is what we're trying to do. And I do think that the development world is accelerating and getting towards that, because there's a shared ambition and objective here, and I think the development community is wanting to do it.
Thank you. Gwyn?
Given the seriousness and the urgency of what we're facing in terms of climate change, it's difficult to say that we're getting there in the right time. I think we still have to do a lot more. What slightly concerns us at the moment is we're in a state of limbo with the London plan in terms of zero carbon, because that's only triggered when it actually gets adopted or formally published. And that's obviously sitting in a bit of a limbo at the moment. So that's of concern. But I think the policies that we've put in place in our transport strategy is a really good starting point. But I think we need to do a lot more. I mean, there's no doubt about it, given the urgency of what we've faced at the moment. I think one of the things that I'm coming back to Deborah's question, we are looking long term, because the one thing that we did on thermal comfort was to understand where there would be heat stress as a result of the temperature rises forecast in 40, 50 years. And we've got a heat stress map of this and a future scenario. And we're thinking this is where we should be planting now mature plane trees. So in 40, 50 years time, when the summers are hotter, they'll create shade in those areas and so on. So we are looking to the 50 to the 60 year targets, but I think there is much more urgency in what we should be doing.
Thank you. And I have a question from Twitter. What does this city need to do to green the many older buildings that are emitting excessive gas and heat? consumptions. Is there any appetite to refurbish and not just demolish and rebuild?
I mean, I think this goes back to the embedded carbon and circular economy issue. There are some really good exemplars of where existing structures being reused. 100 Liverpool Street in Broadgate is a really good example. There are numerous other examples. That would be our starting point. But there is a danger in being too advocating this, because there are instances you can flog a dead horse for another 20 years. You've got an old building. You can do stuff to it now which will prolong its life. But is that preferred over having a brand new building which can be deconstructed, reconstructed elsewhere with a life of 80 years on site, and then what's the long, and that's a discussion that the architects are going through at the moment. But we would advocate at the first point in any building, you look at reusing the existing structure because of the embedded carbon, and the circular economy needs to be absolutely part of any scheme going forward.
Thank you.
And I would add to that to say that no one in their right mind is going to endure the cost of retrofitting all these energy saving measures on an existing building if it doesn't get the return. It's just mathematics, it simply won't happen. And so there is a point where the best thing to do is to produce a new building that is so much more energy efficient inherently within the structure itself. As Gwyn says, lasts a lot more than just one lifetime. But retrofitting an existing building that was only built for 25 years, if it's not viable, it won't happen.
I think also an issue that's been coming up is about maybe we should look at things like materials exchanges. If we are going to reclad buildings or reuse things, we need to have, rather like we're now more accepting of the logistical challenges of deliveries and the fact that we might need systems that put in place to allow that last mile to be delivered more environmentally. Maybe we need to work on projects that look at saying, if you looked at the whole city, what's the material that's going out, and being, you know, how can we recycle it? And maybe there's going to be a city material exchange. So, you know, the granite from one scheme could be reused on another scheme. It's something that's just, I'm hearing whispers from certain clients that have larger estate holdings. It's something that might be worth it now with the shifting economic profile that's coming up. And maybe if you reuse material, you get some credits in terms of planning gain and planning sympathy, because you're going that extra mile materially as well as you know, environmentally.
Thank you, Deborah. I think we should have some sort of sharing innovation board to propose certain solutions, because we may find out that these are actually acceptable by various developers and then planners to use sort of different innovative solutions that what we've done so far. Now, I just wanted to allude to the recent approval of redevelopment of 50 Fenchurch Street. I've read that the architect Eric Parry said that the design journey of this urban proposition has been one of the most remarkable alignments between the commerce, culture, and the public realm that I have ever experienced. The proposal will unite more than 800 years of the City of London history with its future in a development that will dramatically improve the experience of the city for all. So I wanted to ask a question to all of you. How important is it to ensure this switch in thinking that all of you mentioned to some extent, where such alliance of commerce, of culture and public continues to provide joint benefits for all? Because historically, the relationship between heritage, commercial space, public space has often been difficult. Because each of these stakeholders had to work, you know, in silos to protect their own interests. So what needs to change in terms of policy and collaboration to unlock this universal value to all, to the people, to places, planet, public sector and investors? Barnaby, can we start from you?
Yes, I mean, I recall the days 20 odd years ago when the big banks would say we cannot have retail in the ground floor of our building, we cannot have a public because of the man with the rucksack might endanger the operation of the bank, etc. And you know, every scheme these days is welcoming building social spaces, touchdown spaces, And I can't recall any tenants at the moment are saying we cannot have a building like that. It is now the norm. But it wasn't necessarily a policy-driven thing. It just, that's the world has been moving. He's a stick to create even to embrace that in a policy as such.
Thank you. So we see this sort of push and pull in terms of
natural evolution.
Okay, Gwyn, what's your view?
When you think back to the kind of buildings we were permitting in the 80s and early 90s, they were basically inward-looking tombs for those buildings, for those occupiers. They weren't particularly outward-facing, and they didn't contribute much back to wider society. They were almost kind of places to make money and then to leave. I think you need a much more holistic, balanced sense of how a scheme offers back to the wider public in the wider sense. So 50 Fenchurch Street, and that's a wonderful quote by Eric. What he was alluding to there was this connected by a single lift cord down to a 12th century vault public exhibition where you visit the past and then you come up to the 10th floor into the roof garden, the future, the new city square and so on. So the development these days has to work so much harder than it used to 10, 15 years ago to tick so many more boxes. Planning is becoming increasingly complex, or maybe it's too much of a simplification to say that 20 years ago, if it looked okay and you could service it, it was fine. Today, the actual toolkit of a planner, especially on a tall building, is immensely complicated. And there are so many boxes that you have to tick to get this real kind of holistic package on a scheme.
Thank you. Deborah, what's your view? How can we improve this collaboration?
Well, I think as things get more complex, you almost have to work out a very simple way of keeping your mission, a mission statement to every project. And I think as long as you have a vision for a project, you can weather the storms of all the different parameters and kind of challenges that come in your path as a team. And so I think what has happened and what will happen is that things will have been and are becoming more people focused, that the first-hand perspective on the ground, the journey through a building, the journey through a city, it's much more people focused. And I think now it's going to be much more people and planet focused. So really simplistic things to say, but in fact, it's the simple things that count. That if at each juncture of a project you say, when I work on office buildings, I work on residential, I work on public realm, across the sector, but if you make it people focused from the beginning, you often find your problems are easier to solve. And I think one of the things that we always do is do lots of research. And I think what we need to do in the process of assessment and building buildings, again, going back to this long now, is we need to embed research. So lots of research of a site beforehand to really understand, as Gwyn was saying, you know, what's the ecology going on here? And then when it finishes, it's not finished, do lots of proactive post-occupancy engagement and evaluation. Because every time I design an office block, I don't just sit and sketch. I go and look and visit many, many other office blocks, and I learn and capture that learning. And I think we need to kind of share that learning more, but also embed it into the process. So research and people is my kind of focus as a practice.
Thank you, Deborah. And we have a question from the audience for Gwyn. Could you explain how the city is planning to reduce the embodied carbon of new approved buildings?
The embodied carbon, I mean, we have a new raft of policies coming into the city plan, which is going out to consultation soon, the second round of consultation. What we tell a developer at the outset is, I mean, for fear of repeating myself, can you retain the existing building? Can you have the added uplift by using the existing building, much like on Liverpool Street? That can't be done. What you need to come up with is a mechano kit of a building, which can be disassembled, which can be modified to the life of the building on that site. And when that building does come down, which inevitably might come down, you can reuse those elements and rebuild the building somewhere else. That's a key understanding of that at the very early stage of the planning process. So you're almost looking at a whole new genre of architecture based on Meccano kit. And I think that's, and we're seeing that 50 Fenchurch Street elements of that and so on. So that's the key number one request that we have at the first kind of pre-application stage.
Okay, thank you. So we just have a few more minutes. So I just wanted to ask the three of you to give us maybe a couple of minutes of sort of final remarks and final messages that we would like to convey in terms of greening the city, to, you know, to improve sustainability of this area, but also to improve well-being and public health. What are the key things that you think we should work on, are important, you are paying particular attention to, and encourage everybody else to look at as well? Can we start from Barnaby?
Yes, I'm just going to draw on personal experience at the moment. I've spent the last 8 weeks staring out of the window of my son's bedroom at the top of the house. And one of the things that's very apparent to me is I just miss the visual stimulation of things I've taken for granted previously, which is just walking along a street and seeing the bird hopping from tree to tree, seeing a bit of greenery fluttering in the wind. And I'd like to see some of the sort of deader spaces in the city where buildings have an unfortunate junction with each other being reclaimed. I think there's a guy in Lambeth called the Urban Gorilla or something like that, who puts pot plants out in these funny little nooks and crannies and just reclaims it. That'd be a rather fun thing to do, and there's lots of instances in the city where that would work to just create even more visual stimulation than there is already. It's not just the static building, but the greenery that goes on it could be very interesting.
Thank you. Deborah?
I think what I would really like to see is more of an understanding of people's journeys. We talked earlier about people, what were you doing in lockdown? And if you think in London, 1 in 5 people don't have access to a garden in their homes. So the journey to and from work is so important, you know, then they arrive at that destination. So for me, I would like to see, particularly in the city, more of a conversation about the magnificent nature and natural capital of the river, because it's part of the city. Half of that river, that strip, is the city. I think it's going to be amazing if we can see a revolution in the way that we use the river now with this active travel, if we can zip up the Thames, as I call it. At the moment, I'm in Vauxhall. I want to go to a meeting in the city. I would love to walk out to the wharf at St. George's and get on a boat with my bike and get out at the city. I would like to continue on further than Tower Bridge, all the way down, where there's huge inequality in terms of transport access. You know, if instead of the bridge that was going to go over at Rotherhithe, let's look at a whole sequence of little fast ferries along the river. I think that part of nature and the well-being that could really revolutionise how London sort of thinks of itself. And
if any of you haven't seen yet the map that DSDHA has created, I looked at it and it looks amazing. It's something along the lines where you describe the dynamics of ideas on my doorstep rather than inertia of not in my backyard. And I really love the sentence where you're turning homemakers into heroes, entrepreneurs into environmentalists, and park keepers into pop stars. So I really love how you drew this map with green spaces and the river at its heart. So very interesting, and I think you should all have a look at it. And Gwyn, what's your last key message to our audience?
I think my key message is, I don't like to use the word miracle cure, but urban greening solves all. It's really important in solving so many issues. I had to keep on making a list because you forget the benefits in terms of absorbing carbon, generating oxygen, captures air pollution, particulates. It's an exemplar of sustainable drainage in time of climate. Biodiversity, birds. It absorbs noise, and as Deborah was saying, it has a soothing sound quality in itself. Cools the surrounding areas in terms of urban cooling and so on. but critically, I think, especially coming out of COVID-19, it has an immense impact on people's health, well-being, and how they feel about an area. And I think it is in my book up there as a miracle cure. And I think it should be integrated in every single scheme in the city with gusto, with a radical intervention as well.
Thank you. And to add to the benefits, we know that it's not only making us feel better and healthier, but these environmental factors are actually have a positive impact to productivity, which is so important for all the businesses. So that's why we see it as sort of push and pull in terms of, you know, the demand and the supply. This is important because it's actually make you a better performing person, whether it's working or doing your chores, you know. So thank you very much for this insight from all of you. It was a pleasure to have you all because you are experts in what you do, and I'm really excited that we got to listen to your ideas and aspirations for the City of London, and we hope that it will have all of the schemes thriving, green, and available to the public for us all to enjoy very, very soon, because we, as Barnaby said, we all miss the city and the variety of places that we all create. Thank you very much, and I wish you all a nice day. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.